Shocking twist. The US will not be buying Bitcoin in 2025, and the entire Bitcoin community was hoping for massive purchases from the U.S. Now there is a report from Galaxy Digital which makes it very clear. No, the USA will not buy Bitcoin. We have a significant leak indicating potential disappointment ahead. It's important to note that this is just one source claiming the US will not buy Bitcoin. This doesn't guarantee it will happen, but it's an intriguing story because it comes from an official leak suggesting the US might not be as aggressive with Bitcoin. A Bitcoin reserve might still emerge, but not as people imagined, with the US buying 1 million Bitcoins. Instead, they might convert confiscated Bitcoins into a reserve. This leak originates from insider Alex Thorn, who made these explosive statements. At the same time, however, it could still mean that a Bitcoin reserve will come here in a weakened form, but not the Bitcoin reserve that people dreamed of, that the USA will buy 1 million Bitcoin, but 2001 at most, the USA will convert its Bitcoin that it has confiscated here and turn this into a Bitcoin reserve. The whole leak comes from an insider, specifically Alex Thorn, who is the one dropping these explosive statements. You've also heard it from a few people who were very, very skeptical, saying, no, there won't be a strategic Bitcoin reserve coming. Now let's take a close look at his statements and see how he comes to the conclusion that the US will not be buying Bitcoin. It says in an article, which I will link for you below, Galaxy Report, that the US government will not be buying Bitcoin in 2025. We already know that. Load researchers from Galaxy Digital confirm that the US will not be buying Bitcoin in the new year. So just to repeat, the strategic Bitcoin reserve is off the table. And that's basically what this article is about. It's also important to point out that this leak comes from a relevant company, Galaxy Digital, which is led by Michael Novogratz. Some of you might have heard of him. He often makes statements about Bitcoin and crypto. It's worth mentioning that he has a bit of a shitcoin side to him as well. But Galaxy Digital is one of the most well-known companies, as it connects traditional financial services with the world of cryptocurrencies. It has become one of the key players bringing institutional investors into the crypto market. But Galaxy Digital is one of the best-known companies, it says, that combines traditional financial services with the world of cryptocurrencies. It has become one of the key players bringing institutional investors into the crypto market. So they're not just focused on Bitcoin, they're also involved in all kinds of crypto stuff, but they also have a certain reputation to uphold. That means they definitely have a certain standing, and they really can't afford to just throw out any random nonsense. I mean, you see it again and again that some people, some no-names, just throw out some things e.g. Yeah, Germany bought Bitcoin, Germany sold Bitcoin, or something like that. Of course, any no-name can just post stuff on Twitter. But Galaxy Digital has a certain reputation. They're an investment firm and probably have a lot of assets under management. I don't know exactly how much, but it definitely adds more relevance to the whole situation. The article goes on to say that this will basically disappoint the entire Bitcoin community. I mean, this isn't anything new. It's kind of obvious or just plain to see. And then it says here that Alex Thorn, head of research at Galaxy Digital, soberly predicts that the US government will not buy Bitcoin in 2025. What makes me a bit skeptical here is that it says he predicts, so if you read between the lines, it doesn't necessarily mean he knows for sure that they won't be buying Bitcoin. Because the way it sounds, it seems like they have a report and they clearly know that they won't be buying Bitcoin. Here it gets a bit nuanced again because it suddenly says predicted. But the question is, what are his predictions based on? Are his predictions based on some insider leaks, or are they just his own conclusions? It also mentions that long-term, despite his cautious predictions for 2025, Alex Thorn is actually quite optimistic. Are his predictions based on some insider leaks, or are they just his own conclusions? It is also mentioned here that in the long term, Alex Thorn is quite optimistic despite his cautious forecasts for 2025. Within the ministries and agencies, there will be some dynamics to explore an expanded Bitcoin reserve policy. So he says that this could definitely still happen, but it won't go down in the drastic way that a lot of people are expecting. There were all sorts of different models. Some people said, for example, the ultra bull case if the US buys 4 million Bitcoin, which Robert Kennedy Jr. has also called for. Then there were the 1 million Bitcoin demands from Cynthia Loomis, and there were also some toned-down reforms suggesting just converting Bitcoin into a reserve. What it will ultimately turn out to be, we'll just have to wait and see. I probably don't expect the ultra bullish version either. 4 million Bitcoin is just unrealistic. I don't think the US could even pull it off if they wanted to. And now there's another perspective here from James Lavish and Preston Pitch. They were together on the podcast and talked about the strategic Bitcoin reserve, sharing some really interesting insights. And this is really about whether the US is buying Bitcoin to strengthen the US dollar while simultaneously selling off gold reserves to weaken other nations that hold gold. And here you see a completely different picture. So we really have different statements now. One camp, like Galaxy Digital Yuzen, says, no, there will definitely not be a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And then there are these guys who are saying something different. One camp, like Galaxy Digital Yuzen, says, no, there will definitely not be a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And these guys here, they're saying something different.
Listen up. Okay, what Michael is suggesting is really interesting. That's radical, right? The first step is to set up the reserve. We're setting up a reserve under Lummis's law, which would own 5% of all Bitcoins, right? That's pretty significant. That alone triggers this game theory, where other nations and states have to adopt it, or else they'll fall behind because we'll have it in our treasury. We'll have it on our balance sheet, and the U.S. dollar will be strengthened because of that, right? But if you turn around and use our gold reserves to sell off gold, pushing down the gold price while buying Bitcoin, then you can buy. I think he said he found out that it would be almost 20% of the supply, which is a huge amount. And then you strengthen the dollar. What Michael is advocating for, or what he's saying, is that the game theory would play out in such a way that you'd have the ultimate asset, the ultimate store of value in Bitcoin and the dollar. Will not go anywhere, and they will work together, the USA. The dollar will still be the most sought-after currency in the world, but it will be strong because of Bitcoin, not because of the U.S. Treasury. And that's exactly where we are today, where I've talked endlessly about the debt spiral and how there's no way out without massive inflation. So that's a problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem. So it's radical. I'm not sure how it would work exactly. And the reality is that the BRICS countries, as much as they talk about creating their own currency, they will not create their own currency. That will not happen. That's a lot of dictators. They will never trust each other with a central currency among them. This seems kind of pointless to me, but it's just playing around. He just says, no, I agree with everything he says, but they could use Bitcoin, and they could somehow back something with gold. But all they're really trying to do is avoid holding U.S. bonds. Bonds because of this massive mistake that Biden made a few years ago when he seized Russia's bonds. It was such a huge mistake. It sent a message to the whole world, like, hey, if you're not perfect allies with us, we might seize your assets. So you better wrap up the dollarization. It was literally a message to the world. So they're trying to break free from it. And what Michael is saying is, you know what, make sure everyone gets the dollar. Let's protect the dollar, and you can use Bitcoin for that.
I agree with everything James has said. I think if they create this Bitcoin treasury, it will be the shot heard around the world. It's going to be huge, like unimaginable.
So here, things are being viewed a bit more bullishly. Here, Preston Pitch clearly states again that this is going to be huge when they implement the Bitcoin reserve strategy. But it's also clearly mentioned here that in the radical way that Michael Saylor is calling for, it means that whenever he talks about Michael, he's not talking about just any random Michael, but specifically Michael Saylor, because Michael Saylor is also calling for reducing gold reserves, just like Cynthia Lummis. And here it's also clearly mentioned again that this is indeed a very radical step. So you really have to think about whether to do something like this and whether it will actually be carried out with that level of radicalness. And here it is clearly mentioned again that this is indeed a very radical step. That means you really have to think about whether you want to do something like that and whether it will be carried out in such a radical way here. I have also heard arguments again and again that it would actually be a great step to sell the gold here, because there is no gold anyway. It's basically the only place where the USA has any gold certificates, but there doesn't seem to be any gold in Fort Knox. So this is a really wild conspiracy theory that you have to question, but it's something you hear every now and then, that it could be the ultimate chess move. Because on one hand, you'd be opening up to Bitcoin, strengthening the dollar through Bitcoin, and on the other hand, you'd solve your gold problem. If you could credibly sell your gold, that way, you might even be able to maintain all those paper claims and possibly even turn a profit, and people wouldn't catch on. You could pull off this ultimate scam, but that's a pretty far-fetched tactic. So I think there's definitely some gold in Fort Knox. Maybe not as much as a lot of people think, but the idea that there's no gold in there at all is probably a bit of a stretch. Definitely very, very interesting, the BRICS and US story, like how it all connects. Here, James Lavish really emphasizes that the BRICS nations are done holding US Treasury bonds, and they want alternatives. For example, gold they want, for example, Bitcoin, that's why Russia is opening up to Bitcoin. China has definitely opened up to Bitcoin, but they haven't publicly stated it yet, because that would really be the downfall, just like James Lavish says for the US when Joe Biden froze Russian assets. You don't want to have money in an account when, hey, at the bank, someone's freezing funds every 2 minutes. Instead, you go to a bank where, hey, my money won't get frozen, or at least not as often, and there are fewer problems. Or if you don't want to rely on a bank at all, you just go with Bitcoin. The significant problem is that no one can actually really see what's going on with Donald Trump. There are some analysts from Galaxy Digital who apparently have insider information, which is nice and all, but it could also happen at any moment that Donald Trump, even if he decides not to create a reserve right now, might choose to set up a Bitcoin reserve in 20, 30, 100, or even 200 days. It could also become more relevant in the future if the dollar loses even more traction. They might eventually be forced to do something different because that's always the thing. As long as everything is still functioning reasonably well, you can just keep going. If things stop working, then maybe we need to change something. The big danger we're facing right now is that the Bitcoin reserve is probably already priced in, and if it turns out that the Bitcoin reserve doesn't happen, we could see the air get let out of the Bitcoin market at first. A lot of people might say, oh crap, I was betting on the Bitcoin reserve coming, and if it doesn't, we could see some sell-offs. This does not mean that Bitcoin will fail in the long term. These are simply short setbacks, which we have to take calmly. In the long run, over the course of a year, it won't make any difference whether a Bitcoin reserve comes next year or not. Sooner or later, Bitcoin will find its way, so there's no need to stress about it. So if it doesn't happen now, it'll just happen in 5 years. If it doesn't happen in 5 years, then another country will do it, and the US will be forced to create a Bitcoin reserve eventually. So in the end, it's just game theory. Bitcoin will find its way. The question is whether it will happen next year under the Trump administration or at some other point. If you want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link to Bitcoin down below. The easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. Super easy, simple. Here, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code BitcoinHotel. Absolutely recommend it. I'm saying goodbye to El Salvador here. Let me know what you think. Do you think a Bitcoin reserve is coming? Peace out, everyone.